Welcome to the Check-In, a podcast by the Telos group on the Telos channel. The Check-In is a semi-regular conversation amongst the Telos team and guest experts, where we explore the headlines from Israel-Palestine and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David Catabot, checking in from Washington, D.C. today. On today's episode, we are continuing the important conversation on the campus protest movement against the war in Gaza that's happening across the country and world, exploring conversations around language and how it is used to include or exclude others, what student safety really means, the history and definitions of Zionism, anti-Zionism, and antisemitism, and how we might ultimately turn our focus to the important story of the moment, which is what is happening in the region. As millions of Palestinians in Gaza are facing famine, a ground invasion, and displacement, and Israeli families continue to press their government to return their loved ones still held hostage and end the war. This episode is split into two parts, which we recorded separately, a result of delayed and canceled flights and an unexpected sickness of yours truly, but we think you'll appreciate the extra time spent navigating these complex topics. The first is a conversation between Telos team member Sarah Sturm and Rabbi Jill Jacobs. Rabbi Jacobs is the CEO of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, an organization that trains and mobilizes more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors and their communities to bring a moral voice to protecting and advancing human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. She is the author of Where Justice Dwells, a hands-on guide to doing social justice in your Jewish community, and There Shall Be No Needy, Pursuing Social Justice Through Jewish Law and Tradition, both published by Jewish Lights. Rabbi Jacobs has been named 3 times to the Forward's list of 50 influential American Jews, to Newsweek's list of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and to the Jerusalem Post's 2013 list of women to watch. Sarah and Rabbi Jill have an important conversation on Zionism, antisemitism, and how to engage for mutual flourishing in a way that resists all forms of dehumanization. We think it will offer a really helpful grounding for the second half of the episode, which features a conversation more directly around the campus protests, featuring Greg Khalil, president of Telos, Sarah Sturm, myself, and Marina Klimchuk, a former member of the Telos team and a journalist who has reported on the encampments from New York and California. She is currently based in Durham, North Carolina, but has lived in Germany, Israel, and elsewhere, reporting on Israel-Palestine and Ukraine issues. We have a very honest conversation on what's been missing in the media reporting on the protests, what it looks like to both critique and listen to understand to protest movements, and how we can keep our focus on the urgent matters of the moment. We hope you stick around for the second half of this episode. With that, enjoy the show.
This is Sarah Sturm checking in from Washington, D.C. Jill, where are you checking in from today?
I'm in New York City.
Well, we're so grateful you could join us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
In the context of the current moment, including with all of the campus protests, there's been a lot of discussion about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, how the two are related, how they differ. And I think a lot of us who are watching these unfold are wondering how we navigate that. Many of the protesters say that they're protesting alongside anti-Zionist Jewish classmates, and that while their slogans and phrases might be anti-Zionist, that doesn't mean that they're inherently anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. Other students on campus feel differently. And I'm hoping you can help us understand a little bit more. What is anti-Zionism, and what's the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Sure. Well, these are very big questions. Why don't I start by talking about what Zionism is before we talk about what anti-Zionism is? So Zionism is a political movement that was forged originally in the late 19th century in the context of a lot of other national and minority rights movements. So it was a moment when it was the end of empire, the rise of nation states, and lots of minority groups were saying, well, we also want a nation state. And for Jews who were scattered within many countries and many empires, the question was, well, what is the right way for Jews to be safe? What is the right what is the right way to move forward? And there were many options on the table. So one option is demanding political and cultural autonomy in the places where they lived. So demanding language rights and political rights to be recognized collectively as a group. One option was to hope and believe that liberalism, that the Enlightenment would lead, and the acceptance of individual but not collective rights as Jews would lead to safety for Jews. That, of course, did not actually work out, certainly not in Europe or in what became the Soviet Union. And the third option is to say, well, just like every other ethnic group is trying to get collective rights in a state of their own, so also Jews should have a state of their own. Or, well, I'll say actually, when Zionism, in early Zionism, it wasn't necessarily clear that what people would be looking for was necessarily a state, but there was a collective movement to return to the historic Jewish homeland of what's now the land of what has been the land of Israel. Palestine has different names at different moments in history, but at that point, before the First World War, was part of the Ottoman Empire. And so there was beginning to be a group of Jews saying, well, we should return to our historic homeland. There always had been a Jewish community. There was a continuous Jewish community there, but a small Jewish community. We should return there either as subjects of the Sultan, right? Subjects of the Ottoman Empire, later the British Empire, and later that developed into working toward the establishment of a state. So that is what Zionism is at its root was the idea that Jews, like other national, ethnic, religious groups, could and should seek independence as a collective. When we talk about Zionism, very often there's very simplistic terms that people use to talk about it. So you have people on one side saying, there's no separating Zionism from Judaism. If you open up any page of the prayer book, if you look at any Jewish holiday, if you look through the Torah, there was always Jews. The Jewish homeland is always land of Israel, and from the moment that we weren't able to be there anymore after the destruction of the Second Temple, we were always praying to go back to it, and so you can't possibly separate out Zionism from Judaism. So one group of people will say that. Another group of people will say, no, Zionism is a political movement that has nothing to do with Judaism. And I want to say that those are both too simplistic. So it is 100% clear that the land of Israel has always been central to Judaism and to Jews. That from the moment of God's first encounter with Abraham to the Israelites leaving Mitzrayim and heading toward the Promised Land, to the time of Jewish sovereignty there, and then following the end of Jewish sovereignty after the destruction of the Second Temple, it is 100% true that 3 times a day Jews pray in our prayers for a return to the land of Israel, that all of our holidays are based around the agricultural cycle, that we have a series of fast days that are about the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. That is 100% true. The innovation of Zionism was not linking Judaism to the land of Israel. That was already has always been very much part of Judaism. The innovation of Zionism was to say that we can use modern political means to return to our homeland rather than waiting for divine intervention. So for much of Jewish history, the belief was that we couldn't possibly reestablish Jewish sovereignty until the Messianic moment, until God intervened. And Zionism said, look, all of these other ethnic groups are establishing their own nation states or their own political and cultural autonomy within the place that they live. And so Jews also can make use of modern political means, specifically whether it was working within the Ottoman Empire, working with the British Empire, navigating international bodies, etc., that the Jews could use those means rather than waiting for a Messianic era. So when we talk about Zionism today, there's always been a lot of different interpretations of Zionism and a lot of different ways that people have related to Zionism. For some people, it's about finding political protection for Jews. For some people, it is based in a religious vision. For some people, it's been based in a labor socialist, democratic socialist vision, right? There's lots of different ways that people have interpreted Zionism, but at its very base, it's the idea that there should be a homeland for Jews and a place that can guarantee safety for Jews, no matter what other countries might do and no matter what kinds of anti-Semitism there are in other countries. Unfortunately, Jews have discovered through many years of our history that even places that originally seem like safe havens end up not being safe. Jews have been expelled from many, many places throughout the course of our history. And of course, in our recent history, we know that before and during the Holocaust, essentially no country in the world was willing to accept Jewish refugees. And so Israel is a place that is committed to being a safe place where Jews can always find refuge.
Jill, I really appreciate the history you're offering. I think that's super important to understand. And even just defining what Zionism is, what you're teasing out is that there have always been multiple forms of Zionism or understandings of Zionism. And that for people today, they have different relationships to Zionism too. And I think that really, I want to bring in two of our first practices of peacemaking, listening to understand and holding competing perspectives in tension. And I think that's really important for our audience, especially as we engage these conversations. To be able to hold different perspectives of Zionism in tension, whether they're Jewish perspectives or other people's perspectives. So I know it's a tall order to ask you to talk about this long history and help us define it and tease out these different perspectives. So I just wanted to flag that for our listeners as well. As Jill is sharing all of these, the different perspectives over time are really important to hold in tension, in part because that's, I think, what lets us have an imagination about what different kinds of Zionism in the future can look like that lean into what Telos would call mutual flourishing. So I just wanted to jump in and say that and remind our listeners of that. And thank you for that historical context.
Thank you. Yeah, and maybe let me say a word about now. We spend a lot of time debating about Zionism. So I just gave some history. But I'm actually less interested, I'll say, in talking about Zionism as a theory, because very often we get very theoretical when we're talking about Zionism. And something that is, and I want to say that, of course, for Palestinians have experienced Zionism very differently, because Palestinians have experienced Zionism as including, for example, the Nakba, that the war in 1948, which resulted in which Jews, Israelis call the War of Independence, but of course also resulted in more than 700,000 Palestinians being expelled or fleeing from their homes. And I want to say that is real, that the Zionist movement, on the one hand, has provided safety for Jews and a flourishing of Jewish culture, and also Palestinians do not have experienced it as something that has displaced them from their homes and have not yet achieved. I hope that Palestinians also will achieve that national that sovereignty and be able to fill their national aspirations, hopefully very soon. So I do want to acknowledge that. I also want to say that with Israel, we spend a lot of time often talking about the history of Zionism. That is really important. And Israel right now is a country. It's a full member of the United Nations, just like every other country. And I hope that someday Palestine will also be a country as a full member of the United Nations. And I'm more interested in talking about what the future is going to look like for both Palestinians and Israelis in that piece of land, to acknowledge that there's roughly 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians in that strip of land, including the 20% of the Israeli citizenship who are Palestinian citizens of Israel, including the Palestinians who are living under occupation. And nobody is going anywhere. And so we need a solution that's going to work for everybody there. And I'm more interested in having pragmatic conversations about that than relitigating everything that happened 75 or more years ago.
That's really helpful, Jill. And as we lean into that pragmatism, I think for a lot of folks, figuring out how to critique the policies of the state of Israel without being labeled as anti-Semitic or falling into anti-Semitism, it's something that a lot of people have anxiety around or need a little bit more education around how to do effectively. Because most people don't want to be anti-Semitic, right? Not just not called anti-Semitic, they don't want to be anti-Semitic. And yet there's a lot of nebulousness or a lack of clarity sometimes, I think intentionally, around what that line looks like. Can you help us understand what legitimate critiques of the state of Israel look like, what might be called anti-Zionism in some spaces, and what then crosses the line to anti-Semitism? And again, I know that's a huge question we can't, definitively answer all today, But for folks on this call, what's a good litmus test? What's a starting point for understanding what a legitimate form of critique of Israel is versus when it starts to cross the line into anti-Semitism?
Okay, so first of all, I just want to separate out. So first, these are great questions and complicated questions and really important ones. I do want to separate out criticism of Israel from anti-Zionism, because we can criticize Israel the way that we criticize any other country. When we criticize the United States, we don't consider ourselves anti-American, right? That is actually patriotic to criticize the United States. Let me talk about some of the ways that we certainly can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. So the first thing, as I've said, Israel is a country. And the kind of quick test or maybe the cheat sheet of how to check whether your criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic or not is to say, is this something that I would say about another country? And think about the other country that you are most angry at because of its human rights policies, whether that's China or the US or Sudan, or right, fill in Syria, fill in any other country that you're thinking about, that you know something about, and say, would this sentence make sense about that country? Right? It's like remembering that Israel is a country just like any other. It's not some other entity other than a country. So that's the kind of like cheat sheet, but I'll give a few more specifics. So one, certainly criticizing Israel based on its human rights record, its policies, its adherence or its failure to adhere to international law. That is how you would criticize any country. Again, as a member of the UN, Israel has the exact same human rights obligations as every other country. There's, of course, not a single country that meets all of those human rights obligations, but some do it better than others. So anything that is based on what international human rights law is, absolutely is fair game. Israeli policy, I would say, just want to say in here that Israelis are the harshest critics of their own government. Right now, as we speak, Israelis have been on the street protesting practically every day for the last year and a half. First, there was almost a year of protests against the new extremist government that was elected a year ago, November, so about a year and a half ago, that were certainly every Saturday night, hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the street and often days in between. And then immediately after there weren't protests, both because of security reasons. There were missiles falling in major cities, and also because there was a national mourning and a pulling together. But now Israelis are out on the street. Even as we speak, I've seen a whole bunch of WhatsApps coming to my phone from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and other places about protests in the street to end the war, to get a hostage deal, to stop the invasion of Rafah. So just to know that this is what Israelis are doing. Israelis feel rightly that their government is stopping any kind of a hostage deal and leaving their family members to die in Gaza, and families of hostages are leading protests, and those protests are explicitly calling for a deal that would end the war. So just I want to say that, and to say that even before the war, for almost a year, Israelis were out in the street protesting their government basically every night. So protesting policies, criticizing protesting policies, international law. The second piece is boycotting Israel or its territories. I'm going to be a little bit careful about this, but I'll say that any country can be subject to boycott. We're all boycotting Russia. We're all boycotting Syria. We're all boycotting North Korea. If I announced that I wanted to boycott Canada for some reason, people would probably look at me funny, but I have the right to do so. I can boycott any country that I want. And, the U.S. Has stopped, for example, imports from the Uyghur region of China because goods are produced under forced labor. So boycotting a country is not anti-Semitic. Boycotting people is anti-Semitic. So, for example, if I walk into a store in the United States and somebody says, well, I won't serve you because you're Jewish, 100% that is discrimination and it's illegal. If somebody who is an Israeli national who's in the United States walks into a store and they won't serve that person, the same thing just as would be true if somebody who's Chinese or Russian, right, in the United States walks into a store. you can't discriminate against people because of their religion, because of their national origin, because of their ethnicity. That is different than that same store saying, we're not going to buy products from Israel or China or any other country, right? Because that is dealing with it as a country. And I will also just note again that 20% of Israel's population are Palestinian citizens of Israel who are equally affected by the boycott as Jewish citizens would be. So simply boycotting is not anti-Semitic. There is, of course, anti-Semitism inside of the BDS movement. I'll get to that later, but just saying that you're going to boycott Israel or you're going to boycott the territories, products produced in the settlements is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. So that actually gives a lot of leeway to protest the war, to boycott the country, to protest specific Israeli policies, to protest the invasion of Rafah, right? There's a lot of leeway to protest Israel, again, as you would protest any other country. So some of the places where we start to move into anti-Semitism, one is when you're using classic anti-Jewish tropes to describe Israel or Israelis. So that would be tropes like Jews as greedy, obsessed with money. Those are tropes that go way, way back to medieval times, believing that Israel or the Zionists, often it's phrased, are somehow controlling the world. That goes back to probably the most famous modern anti-Semitic forgery, which is Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is an very early 20th century piece of writing that purports to be a record of a meeting of Jews about controlling the world. Obviously, it's a forgery. It's written by a Russian anti-Semite. So this idea of Jews as like a Jewish conspiracy that wields outsized power, when you see those kinds of tropes come to describe Israel, Israeli Zionists, when it starts to be portrayed not as a country, but as some kind of a shadowy force, now you're into anti-Semitic territory. You see that, of course, on the right. Also, you see language about globalists, the idea of the Great Replacement Theory, the idea that Jews are trying to replace so-called real Americans, that is white Christian Americans, with non-white, non-Christian immigrants. That's the kind of rhetoric that led to the horrific shooting and murder of Jews in Pittsburgh, as well as murders of non-Jews like in El Paso, Latino immigrants in El Paso, and Black shoppers in Buffalo. It's that idea that these gunmen had, that Jews are trying to basically import or have non-white people take over the country from so-called real Americans, real white Americans, right? So you see that on the right. On the left, you sometimes see this trope of Zionists are controlling the U.S. government. The Mossad carried out 9/11. You see that kind of conspiracy theory. And also holding Israel or Zionism responsible for a host of other sins, like basically saying Zionism is behind white supremacy, U.S. imperialism, that kind of a sense of like the Zionists are controlling all of the institutions and all of U.S. foreign policy. That is an anti-Semitic territory. When people talk about Zionists, I always want to know what they actually mean. I would say that it's not actually helpful to talk about Zionists as a category. As I said, Zionism is a political movement from the 19th century about establishing Jewish autonomy and ultimately in the land of Israel. But sometimes when people talk about Zionists, I do always want to say, well, who do you mean? Do you mean Jews? Do you mean Israelis? Do you mean people who believe that Israel should continue to exist? Like, let's actually talk about what we mean, because sometimes the word Zionist is actually a substitute for Jew or for Israeli. Okay, so those are a few categories, and I'll just add a couple more. One is denying Jewish history. So you hear this when people say things like, well, Jews never had any connection to the land of Israel, or the thing that comes up a lot is, well, Jews are just European colonizers, and oh, look at these white people. How could you possibly have any connection to the land of Israel? How could you be from the Middle East? Or repeating, there's an anti-Semitic conspiracy that modern-day Jews are not real Jews. They're descendants of Khazar converts from medieval Caucasia, right? So that is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that unfortunately has become much more live. And that all just ignores the realities of Jewish history, which is that there absolutely was Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel before the Roman conquest in 70 of the Common Era. The Jews have always prayed and fasted for a return to the land. And also that the Jews who are in Israel now came in different ways. Many of them come from families that have been in that land continuously for generations and generations and centuries. Many of them came as refugees from Europe before or during or after the war. Many of them came as refugees from North Africa and the Arab world, very often also in the 1940s, 50s. Many of them came as refugees from the Soviet Union. And they're not people certainly who could go back somewhere else. And people immigrated for all the reasons that people immigrate to the United States or people immigrate to other places, whether it's for family or work or ideology or any other kind of way that people immigrate. So, the language that says that they're never, like, for example, you hear things about the alleged temple in Jerusalem. Like, there's denying Jewish history is certainly anti-Semitic. Denying Jewish connections to land are certainly anti-Semitic. And then one other big category is denying the humanity of Israelis. We saw that even on October 7th, we saw that there were protests against Israel, even on October 7th, as Hamas terrorists were still running through kibbutzim, murdering and raping and kidnapping Israelis. When you see language like all resistance is justified, that also justifies the murder of Israelis, or arguments that there's no civilians in Israel, that everybody's either a colonizer or everybody's either a past or future soldier, because Israel does have mandatory military or national service. Not everybody actually serves in the military, but it's not the only country in the world that has national service. And so that idea that every Israeli, whether they're a baby or an elder, is a legitimate target for assault is dismissing Jewish lives as not important, not worth mourning over, or just ignore it. We saw a lot of ignoring the death of Israeli Jews. It actually should not be hard to mourn both the deaths of Israeli Jews and also the deaths of Palestinians. I will also note that there were Palestinian citizens of Israel as well as foreign workers killed on October 7th. Not everybody was Jewish. So that should not be hard. But unfortunately, for some people think that mourning Israeli Jews or calling for the release of hostages is somehow lessening their commitment to Palestinians or distracting from Palestinian suffering, which it certainly should not be. So anything that dehumanizes Israeli Jews, conspiracy theories that say that October 7th never happened, treating the lives of Israeli Jews as disposable, is anti-Semitic. We just don't see that language in relationship to residents of other countries. I don't even think when we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, where most people, I would say in this country, certainly 100% condemn the invasion of Ukraine, but I don't see any celebration of the deaths of Russian soldiers who in many cases didn't have a choice of being sent there. There hasn't been, I just want to be clear, I'm not saying the Israelis who were killed on October 7th were by and large civilians. But I don't think there's a celebration. I don't know, for example, when there was a terrorist attack in Russia, I didn't see people celebrating because it was Russians who were killed.
There's so much richness in what you've just laid out, both around how to legitimately critique the state of Israel when necessary, like we would any other nation state, but then also ways that we need to, I'm going to use the language of self-interrogation, self-interrogate anti-Semitism when it comes up in our communities. And asking you to talk about this in a short amount of time is an impossible task, right? You educate on this, we could spend hours and hours diving into this. But I want to land on that practice of self-interrogation, because at Telos, we know that all of us, whether we come from the left or the right, have room to self-interrogate how we and our communities show up in the world, regardless of our intentions. And it's an invitation to ourselves and our communities to try and identify our biases, question assumptions we have, continually assess whether we knowingly or unknowingly contribute to or benefit from injustice. And I think as I hear you talk about all of these different insidious ways anti-Semitism shows up, it's making me think that so often we don't see the waters we swim in. And these ideas might be present. They might not be ones that we hold sacred ourselves or we actively buy into. But when we encounter them, right now that you have laid them out for us, now when we encounter them, we can try and counter them and invite people into a vision of what I'm going to call mutual flourishing, right? That holds the humanity of Israelis and Palestinians as sacred, that recognizes that civilians are never justified targets, that the only good future for anyone in the land is a good future for everyone. All of those things that we know to be true. And yeah, I just so appreciate you laying out those distinctions and what we can start looking for as we engage in our own advocacy to invite folks into a healthier way of engaging that doesn't ignore the very real justice issues that absolutely have to be transformed, but that also doesn't contribute to further dehumanization as we try and advocate against these dehumanizing realities.
I think that many of us have spent lots of time unlearning all sorts of prejudices, but it's a forever process. And that's also true of anti-Semitism, that, anti-Semitism is complicated. It doesn't always look like other prejudices. It's sometimes hard to understand. It's hard to understand in part because Jews don't necessarily neatly fit into a category of religion or race or ethnicity. So it is hard to understand. And that's why there is certainly a challenge for all of us, as we're all unlearning different prejudices, that also, especially for non-Jewish communities, to really understand the history of anti-Semitism and understand where it shows up. Because again, it should not be hard to criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic, just like it shouldn't be hard to criticize, let's say, China without being anti-Chinese, right? Because it's a country. So that is a process. It should not infringe on anybody's ability to criticize Israel when it violates international law, human rights law. It should not infringe on anybody's ability to stand with Palestinians. And it is really important to ensure that that work is done without anti-Semitism.
So Rabbi Jill, as someone who has done this work for a really long time, especially with other rabbis and in Jewish communities, I'd like to get your perspective on a few phrases. These are ones that Congress has determined are inherently anti-Semitic and hateful, but many others would say that these aren't and have offered other nuanced takes on what these can mean. And so I'd love to hear your insight on three phrases specifically. The first is intifada, the second is revolution, and the third is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And feel free to address any or all of those, but we'd love to hear your insight into those phrases and whether or not they're inherently anti-Semitic and hateful, or if there's room for a more expansive understanding.
Okay, so first of all, I want to say that I don't think that Congress should be legislating about certain phrases. I think we should be having conversations in society about certain phrases, but I don't think that Congress has any business legislating around phrases that it considers anti-Semitic or racist or sexist. I think these are big, important societal conversations, but I would say it's a violation of free speech for Congress to be getting involved in trying to legislate them. So I want to say that before I say what I think about these phrases. Okay, so intifada, or sometimes intifada revolution, people say, or globalize the intifada. So for some people, it's when you stop them and say, why are you saying that? They might say that it's the original meaning like uprising or shaking off of oppression, which it could include nonviolent means. But I will say that for me as a Jew, when I hear that, and when most Jews hear that, what we think about is the Second Intifada in 2000 to 2004, which was characterized by suicide bombings of buses, cafes, hotels, discos, universities. I could go on and on, of civilians, people who were just out having dinner or dancing or whatever they were doing. And when we think about globalize the Intifada, it also brings up memories of times that either Palestinian groups or Iranian proxies like Hezbollah have carried out attacks on Jews outside of Israel. So like the hijackings in the 60s, 70s, the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in Argentina in 1994. That's what Jews often hear. And especially in this moment when we've seen shooting attacks, bomb threats, other threats of violence, fire bombings of Jewish institutions like synagogues not only in the United States, but across the world. It's understandable that when Jews hear Intifada revolution or globalize the Intifada, that understand it as carry out attacks on Jewish institutions that are outside of Israel. It's not a necessary term when we think about, again, to go back, we can protest Israel, we can protest Israeli policies, we can protest the war without using a term that most Jews associate with just wanton violence against Israelis or against Jews, and ignoring that. I mean, I think just like in other forms of, if somebody tells me that a certain term is xenophobic or homophobic or racist, like a person from a particular community that's affected, I'm going to listen to that. I'm going to listen to how that word lands, no matter how I might have intended it. And it's really important for people to understand that the word intifada lands on Jews as supporting the murder of Israelis and other Jews. Okay, so also talking about intent and impact, when we talk about from the river to the sea, if you poll somebody who's chanting that or holding that banner and say, what do you actually mean by that? You'll get lots of different answers. So some people would say, I want a single democratic state for both Palestinians and Jews. I don't personally think that is actually something that is possible, that people in the region are asking for, either Palestinians or Israelis for the most part. But I don't think it's anti-Semitic. If you really, really believe that both Palestinians and Jews should be able to live in a single democratic state, like, again, I don't think it's realistic, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. But certainly some of the people who are using that phrase are also saying things like Israelis should all go back to Poland. Again, most Israelis did not come from Poland, or their families did not come from Poland, but or you all are just colonizers, you should leave. So we hear that kind of language. So I'd say that very often Jews certainly hear that as a call to expel Jews from Israel, to end the state of Israel, to that it's only going to be Palestine from the river to the sea, and there's not going to be space for Israel. There's not going to be space for Jews. I would also say, like, there's a few particular echoes that echo for Jews. So, in 1966, Assad said, we're going to drench this land with blood, etc. We're going to throw you into the sea for good, to Jews. So that echoes. And then, of course, the fact that the slogan appears in Hamas's charter, and that Hamas has made it very clear that there's not space for Israel between the river and the sea, makes it hard to hear the phrase as anything but a call to expel Jews, to destroy the state of Israel. And again, I think it's really important to make clear what it is that people are asking for: an end to the war, an end to occupation, Palestinian sovereignty, right? There's a lot of things that one can ask for. There's a lot of criticisms that one can make of Israel without wandering into territory that at least can be understood, or is often understood by Jews, as anti-Semitic.
Absolutely. So at Telos, we believe that advocacy has to be rooted in nonviolence and what we call mutual flourishing: freedom, dignity, security, human rights for Palestinians and Israelis in equal measure. We know, we've witnessed in the US, around the world, that anti-Semitism is real and has to be resisted, as are Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian violence. And we are all called to call movements into a bigger, more expansive vision of mutual flourishing for all of us. And at the same time, right, holding all of that in tension with the fact that we also can't be distracted from what's happening in Gaza and the very deep and real need to transform the realities on the ground, yesterday. Jill, as we wrap up our time together, I'd like you to give us a call to action that comes from you, that comes from your situatedness. How can we support Palestinian human rights and resist anti-Semitism simultaneously from your perspective and where you're sitting?
Wonderful. Thank you for that question, and for this opportunity. So first, in terms of anti-Semitism, it is important for us to look inside of our movements, for everybody who's fighting for Palestinian rights to look inside of their movements and make sure that the slogans, that the language is not anti-Semitic. It does not detract from fighting for Palestinian rights, to spend some time making sure that we're not using anti-Semitic language. It actually strengthens that fight. And then specifically, right now, the things that we all should be calling for and talking to our elected legislators about are an end to the war that includes the release of the hostages. So a deal that includes ending the war, releasing the hostages, ending hostilities on both sides. That means ending Israel's invasion of Gaza, stopping the incursion into Rafah. It also means ending the missile attacks on Israel, and then also supporting increased humanitarian aid and building a future for Gaza, which is going to mean, first, certainly there needs to be basic humanitarian aid to stop the famine that has already started, to help people rebuild their homes, rebuild their lives. But then we need specific steps moving us toward two states. So not lip service to two states, but specific steps that are going to include some international partnerships, not only the United States, but also the Arab states that have shown themselves willing to be part of this process, the EU, other international actors, to take specific steps toward establishing some kind of a new governing order in Gaza and taking very specific steps toward establishing a Palestinian state side by side with Israel, which is the only way that both peoples are going to be able to realize their national aspirations, and basic human rights, including the right to self-determination.
I really appreciate those insights, Jill. And again, listening to understand how those land for people is really helpful as we interrogate how we make our own advocacy as expansive as possible, as oriented towards mutual flourishing as possible. And I really appreciate what you landed on there at the end with, restating what we do believe and what we do want to see, casting that vision for the future in really concrete terms, right? For us, freedom, dignity, security, human rights, inviting people to join that vision that's concrete and specific and rooted in a belief in mutual flourishing. And I appreciate you offering those insights about how these terms land in the communities that you've moved in.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, Jill, thank you so much for your time today, casting some context for the past, helping us name the current moment, then casting some vision for the future as well. We're so grateful for you and the work you're doing advocating for mutual flourishing, and really appreciate all the wisdom and insight you've imparted today. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, we have an amazing group here today with us for this second part or first part of this conversation on the campus protests. We have Sarah with us. Where are you checking in from?
Good morning from Washington, D.C.
We have Greg. Where are you checking in from?
New York City.
And we have our friend, former Telos team member, Marina Klimchuk. Where are you checking in from, Marina?
Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
A piece of my heart. It's a delight to know you're there. That's my alma mater. And I know it may not be super exciting for someone who's traveled the world as much as you have, Marina, but it's a slice of heaven, as we say, those of us who are from there. But we're excited for this conversation. It's an important one. We know there's a lot to discuss. And things are evolving as we speak. We're about a month into this national and even global campus movement. Thousands of students and other protesters have already been arrested, and commencement and graduation ceremonies have been canceled. We've seen protesters walk out of these ceremonies. Some encampments have been completely cleared, while others are still growing. But there's a lot of misinformation circulating around these protests, these student encampments. And Greg and Marina, you both have been on the ground in person witnessing some of these protests, both in New York, and Marina, in your case, also in California. I would love to hear from you both, based on your personal experiences as we get started here. What are some of the common misconceptions people may have about these protests and encampments? What did you see, and how can we have a better picture of what's going on universities across our country? Marina, why don't you start?
Sure. I came to New York, to Columbia, to cover the protests for a German and a Swiss newspaper. And to be fully honest with you, I thought I'm going into this war zone entering campus. And I don't know exactly what I expected, but just coming in there, it was like entering summer camp in a way. It was enormously peaceful. People were very chilled. And there was really an atmosphere of community. And I spent 2 days in Columbia. Yeah, I felt it was really sweet. I felt also that the Jewish people who were part of the protest camp, especially from Jewish Voice for Peace, who felt quite marginalized in their own Jewish communities they had grown up in, they kind of found a new community in those camps where they can be fully themselves and live out their values. So that was Columbia. I spent way less time in UCLA, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So I came there the afternoon after the attack had happened. And that was very tense. It was less of a sweet experience than I saw in Columbia.
Can you update us what happened at UCLA? Some of our listeners may not be aware of the attack that you're mentioning.
Basically, I woke up flying to California and saw that the night has been enormously violent. I flew into LA for actually, not for work, to visit a friend, and I straight went into campus. And it's funny because I consume a mixture of English-speaking American and German media, and well, I saw that there had been trouble, but this is something that what I read on that day is like was really misinformation, because what all newspapers had basically copied the press publication from the agencies. I think it was DPA, where it said that there had been attacks and that there had been clashes between protesters and counter protesters. And getting on campus, I only realized the extent and the severeness of that attack. I mean, there had been like pro-Israeli protesters, and it wasn't only students, it was people from outside that basically had broken down barricades, wooden barricades, had attacked the protesters with tear gas, with metal sticks, threw bottles at them, and people had tried to call the police, and the police had not intervened for around 3 hours, and they had just been completely helpless. And so, yeah, that was my afternoon at UCLA campus. And while all the world media were talking about clashes, that was, yeah, very disconcerting to me. And the other disconcerting thing was that I saw enormous solidarity. Like hundreds of people were there in the line to join the protest camp because they really wanted to support their people and the students. And at the same time, the students were giving a press conference about last night. And that was the other piece that was kind of disturbing, because they were saying stuff like last night, they were speaking of heavy artillery that had been used by the Zionist entity and the Zionist mercenaries, and that one speaker was saying that finally he got a glimpse of what it means to be in Gaza. And I felt quite some discomfort about that press conference. Also, I felt it's kind of disrespectful to the people in Gaza to speak like that. And one of the students were kind of showing his bloody arm. It was a reenactment of something very strange. And I was just surprised that they don't have a better language for these vicious attacks. What I was also very impressed with was the quality reporting of the Daily Bruin, the students' newspaper on UCLA campus. They did the most excellent reporting, the most factual, and like kind of sober in language. So that I want to really point out as a piece of very good journalism.
I'm glad you mentioned the Daily Bruin, Marina. By the way, I don't know if you know, UCLA is my alma mater, so I know that campus well, though I have not been back in many, many years. But I do teach at Columbia. I teach at Pulitzer Hall, which is literally right next to where the encampment was. And I think a lot of listeners are confused about what was happening, why. I think the best reporting on this is from the student newspapers. So Columbia Daily Spectator is on the ground. The radio station, you can go back and you can listen to all the reporting. This is really incredible. And I'm a little biased because Some of the reporting was from some of my students, actually. They were really sort of privileged as journalism students because I think a lot of people felt that they were forced into these two camps. Do you oppose what's happening? Do you support what's happening? And journalism students had a third choice, which was report on it. Like you don't have to necessarily take a very public stance, but to actually make sure that this chapter of history is being covered for others to see and understand. And I think they did the most excellent job reporting. One thing I wanted to say in response to your question, DCAT, of what do people get wrong about, the protests, or the outsiders, or what surprised you? I think for me, there's just really one thing that I would like people to understand, because the protests themselves, there's a lot to talk about around the speech, who was involved when, the tactics, all of that. But there's a bigger point that always gets missed. And that is these protests did not happen overnight. So what I mean by that, at Columbia, there was a history of 7 months since October 7th, but there was even a longer history on how Columbia University approached free speech on this issue and on other issues. And this issue specifically, the administration from day one wanted to restrict any speech related to Palestinian rights and related to Palestine. So they went through these maneuvers to create this rationale last minute to ban Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine from campus. And so that was just in the days after October 7th, for example. And protesters were specifically targeted. I mentioned on another podcast that when I was giving a talk to journalism school faculty with my co-professor, Ari Goldman, about how to handle some of these things in class, because as you might imagine, these divisions are difficult for faculty and administration and all that. There was an actual potential terrorist attack that took place. This was on January 19th on Columbia University's campus, a protest that I saw. 16 students or more than a dozen students had to seek hospitalization. I'm guessing most of you listening hadn't heard about that. But somebody sprayed a caustic substance, potentially a banned chemical weapon, on students, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, no faith, who were protesting for Palestinian rights. And so why I'm mentioning that is the administration just completely wanted to ignore that. Not only did they prevent any conversation and advocacy, but they ignored when there were so many instances, not just that one, of actual physical attacks on students, on doxing, trying to destroy students' careers. Very, very tepid responses to this. And so there was this environment. Similarly, Marina mentioned sort of the Jewish students who were part of the encampment. This is one expression of protest from a segment of Jewish students. There's more than 5,000 Jewish students registered at Columbia. But the point is there were and are varied degrees of representation among this community. And many of the protesters, like some estimate as high as 30, 40%, at least in the encampment, the actual students, not people from outside the community, but happened to be Jewish and felt that their perspectives were targeted and or erased as well. So there's this large context of institutional failure. There's this large context of institutional targeting. And this is not to say that, well, the institution failed, so then everything becomes okay, right? I'm not saying that. What I am saying, though, is that what people are missing is that the institution, and Columbia is the only one I can speak to, was failing. It was failing in protecting the safety of all of its students. It was failing in its core educational mission. It was failing in actually combating anti-Semitism. Instead, it weaponized it by adopting a very politicized decision or politicized definition and application of that definition. And so these protests, this rupture happened because Columbia was not providing a space for its students to express legitimate concerns, to ask questions about how and when it spends its $14 billion endowment. There was no channel. And President Shafiq made very clear from long before the protests during the encampment and on, that there would be no channel for their voices to be heard. And that in fact, certain voices and certain perspectives, and not just anti-Semitic or anti-Palestinian ones or Islamophobic ones, but actual legitimate perspectives would never have a place to be heard on Columbia's campus. And so that's an important point to focus on, because if we're talking about like actually managing division in our families, our communities, our universities, our societies, it's important to remember that if people with real legitimate concerns have no avenue to express them, these ruptures are inevitable.
Greg, that is such an important point for us to consider, especially thinking about our principles and practices of peacemaking, right? The first practice is listening to understand. We spoke about this on our previous podcast episode on the college protests, but when you don't give the opportunity for people to be heard and seen and for their values to be acknowledged and respected, things will bubble up from the surface, as you're saying. And so the first act is to listen, is to find a way to hear without being preparing to rebut or to argue, but to listen, to understand. And, we've seen a couple of different universities commit to that practice, right? And these are the universities where these encampments and these protests actually resulted in peaceful dialogue and opportunities for the university to engage with the students. And ultimately, there was, no need for police or law enforcement to be drawn in. There were no arrests made of students. There were no cancellations of graduation ceremonies and such. This includes universities like Brown University and Northwestern, I believe, and a number of other smaller universities. I think what you're naming here too is really important because it draws out perhaps a really sad irony about the situation, in that there's these calls for the protection of students, right? And this is why we're bringing in the campus police. This is why we're bringing in law enforcement. This is why we are ultimately removing and destroying these encampments to protect students. But you have these situations where these students are not only attacked in the months prior to these encampments, but even at these encampments themselves, right? And many of them are also being very violently apprehended by law enforcement. And we've seen videos of these things happening. And so it raises the question of, what does student safety actually mean when when university administrators are calling for these things? Marina, I'd be curious, you were at UCLA after this attack happened. How did you see the university administrators respond, especially in light of this responsibility that they claim to have about protecting students?
Well, I didn't see them directly respond while I was there, but it was clear that it is being investigated right now, the failure of that night, what happened in that night, because it just doesn't happen for a coincidence that people are desperately calling the police, and the police is telling them, I got some real crime to take care of right now. That doesn't just happen. And there were rumors that no one from the administration was on campus that night, but so they kind of, I don't know if that's kind of an intention to absolve their responsibility, but all in all, it was the administration who sent in the police the night after to dismantle the protest. So that was their decision. And the students saw it coming. Like, someone told us, we have intelligence information. I don't know what they mean by intelligent information, that the protest is going to be dismantled this night. So what does it mean when an administration, after an attack like that, the next night decides to take a step and to send hundreds of policemen and apparently also snipers on campus to destroy their protest camp? So that was really, disturbing to me to see. I also want to just quickly say about the safety and about the listening. I talked to a Jewish girl, to Jewish students in Columbia, and she came from a very, very different side of things. She grew up very Zionist, very in a Zionist youth movement. And what she told me, and that I think we have to be very serious about that too, is that from basically the very beginning of October 7th, she and her friends felt that they're simply not heard. Their pain is not heard. Their grief is not heard, neither by the administration nor by fellow like lecturers, professors, and that basically friendships were falling apart within those discussions in class, and that she and her friends simply isolated themselves as a response to that feeling of not being heard about their experiences. And that I feel also like, what a bummer is it for a university if that happens, that like so many people, Jewish people, and I think majority of them grew up in Zionist institutions, and it's very, you can't just expect from one day to the next denounce all of that. If they feel so unheard, that they have a feeling the only people we can truly trust is ourselves right now.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Marina, because the fact is there are a variety of perspectives that felt unheard on the campus. And I can't speak on behalf of my students and other students and faculty that I know, but that's a very real experience for some Jewish students at Columbia. There's a letter that came out recently from Jewish Zionist students that more than 10% of the Jewish students at Columbia signed with their names. It wasn't, anything anonymous saying as much, and really believing that a lot of the speech that they heard was anti-Semitic. And there was anti-Semitic speech, like on campus and off of campus. So that part is absolutely true. And I think, there was also a lot of anti-Palestinian speech, which we've talked about on other podcasts, and Islamophobia as well. And these things don't cancel themselves out. But the reality is that a lot of communities were feeling unheard and targeted. And some communities were specifically targeted. And, there's a lot to parse out in there. But the one point to make for me, which was most salient, is that we're talking about educational institutions here, right? These are the places where people who end up leading our society, whether it's public or private sector, get trained. I teach at the journalism school. It's where journalists get trained. If we can't create environments where people can be heard and where they can have really deep, difficult, uncomfortable discourse around the issues that are tearing our society apart, what hope do we have that our Congress, our media are going to do their job, which is to make decisions about how we use our shared resources around these issues and really talk about them? I think the journalism school did finally start stepping up, like after October 7th, and really like creating the space, partly because of their role. And I think there are a lot of professors who were doing this, but they're a minority, and the vast majority of the faculty wasn't getting support to actually do this. And quite the contrary, they were having an approach modeled from the administration that was just focused on a few donors, not all the donors. That was very politicized, about sort of bowing down to a politicized inquiry from Congress and whatnot. And so it's really sad to me. And I think the real fight has to be, it's not, were the protesters rule breakers or not? Like, obviously there were some who were, but so was the administration. The administration did a lot of horrible things that you may not have seen, that just, was set up to actually target specific students unjustly, I believe, and I witnessed. The larger goal is that we really have a crisis in our society right now. We talk about polarization. We need to make sure our educational spaces are ones that allow varieties of perspectives in, that create spaces for deep inquiry, that call us to discomfort, not comfort. That's on this issue. That's on a lot of other issues too. Because if we can't do that at our universities, how do you think this is going to shape our society? Our societies are going to continue to be broken. So we need to really focus on the larger point here, that there's a reason for these ruptures. And part of the reason for that ruptures, in my view, the root cause of these ruptures is a systemic long-term failure of our educational institutions to actually do what they're supposed to do.
I think for me too, though, there's another underlying bigger long-term systemic issue, which is that there aren't a lot of spaces or lenses that actually point towards mutual flourishing. And we use that language around Israel-Palestine. I personally use the language of collective liberation in an American context, and as I engage this. But to me, that really gets at this idea that a lot of folks haven't encountered an invitation to engage any of these issues, not through an us versus them binary, but with a real lens towards how do we all flourish and succeed. And I think that's been one of the hardest things for me to watch. I mean, there's so many hard things to watch in the context of these protests and the violent reprisals. But to see folks not have the imagination and institutions not have the imagination of what it could look like to protect and promote the flourishing of Zionist Jewish students, non-Zionist Jewish students, Palestinian students, Muslim students, folks who are caught up in the middle and don't know what they think. Instead of further leaning into these divisions of us versus them and further pushing this kind of false idea of we have to protect part of the student body at the cost of other parts of the student body. And I think one of the things I have found really encouraging, maybe that isn't the right word, that as students have been advocating, especially at campuses where this is going a little bit better than the ones that are making it into the mainstream news media, is the fact that folks are also trying to keep the lens on what's happening in Israel-Palestine, that these protests are rooted in a deep discomfort and unwillingness to be complicit in immense violence that's being carried out with the support of the U.S. on Palestinians. And that all of this is rooted, to me, in an inability to see that bigger picture, that there has to be a future of freedom, dignity, security for Israelis and Palestinians and what that encompasses. But that really that is mirrored then on campus with an inability to see how these movements could be invitational and liberatory and constructive and imaginative, rather than being seen as threats to kind of campus order and the way things have always been.
I think, Sarah, one of the things that you have mentioned previously, early on after October 7th, is this notion that grief isn't scarce, that it's important and actually essential to grieve alongside with all of our friends and all of our neighbors. And Marina, what you're reminding us of is that there are students on these campuses who haven't experienced that kind of solidarity and grief, as they have experienced the past couple of months, and so that has shaped the way that they are engaging with these protests, with these movements, which we can talk about their goals, what we think about them, divestment, transparency, and amnesty for these students. But we can also talk about the way that the language that they're using might be an honest expression of their perspectives, and there might be students who feel that it's not inclusive of them, or it's intentionally creating a barrier from their participation, or in fact even makes them feel unsafe. And Rabbi Jill talked to us about this in the portion with her around for many Jewish students, hearing the word Intifada reminds them of the Second Intifada, which was an extremely violent experience for Israelis in the early 2000s, a time marked by suicide bombings and attacks against civilians, in which many hundreds of Israelis were killed. Right. And so the question I want us to perhaps explore here, as we consider what mutual flourishing looks like, even on these campuses and as a part of our communities here in the States, not only as this end goal in Israel-Palestine, what does it look like to engage in protest, engage in dialogue in ways that bring awareness to these massive injustices, things that are going on? I mean, right now as we speak, an invasion is commencing in southern Gaza and Rafah, where over 1 million Palestinians have fled. Many have been displaced multiple times, who are facing famine conditions, right? Who are, essentially being bombed without reprieve. This is the context that these protesters are wanting to speak in. And there's also perhaps this invitation to mutual flourishing, to an inclusive movement. What do people think about that, especially in regards to even the language that these protesters are using as a part of their demonstrations?
Yeah, that was, I guess, my main disappointment, because I was very happy that the protests exist as a movement. But then actually interacting with people, I interacted with incredibly brilliant people. Like of which everyone had their own vision of the region, of what should happen. But that is not to say that there were very strong mechanisms of exclusion, I encountered. And that is, there were no Israelis included in those protests, or felt the need to include themselves in those protests. And there's a reason for that, because the moment you say that not Zionist people are just not welcome, it's creating something. It's creating that. It's like, if you have that and that kind of attitude, you shouldn't be here. And that is a bummer, because we should be striving towards a common goal, which is, collective liberation, as Sarah called it, or as a very first step, a ceasefire at least. And there are many Israelis who want a ceasefire and who would not feel comfortable in the moment that they're being told you're not welcome here because you grew up that and that way, or because you went to the army. And to me, I was talking to an Egyptian American guy, and he was like, you can't be for genocide and then say that you don't feel safe. And I get that perspective too. I really do. But I feel the protest movement would just be so much more powerful if we could work through these mechanisms of exclusion and come towards something that's together. And yeah, that was kind of my disappointment.
I hear that, Marina. So protests, especially during these fraught times of rupture, are never neat. They're never organized. There are a variety of different expressions of these protests. And that doesn't mean that we should not resist hate speech. We have a heightened responsibility to do that now. And I think the line between, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think there's a big gap from my perspective. But sometimes it does get blurred. Like, I think there's one thing to be against Zionism as a philosophy. And then, some of the stuff that feels like it's targeting Zionists, that feels quite personal in a different way. And there's discussion there. But the reality for many Palestinians and people protesting right now, is that there's an historic atrocity that's happening in real time, and often to their or our families. And like, every expression of solidarity or concern or anger seems to be policed and shut out. You read the media and what you said is distorted. I've read accurate pieces in the New York Times, for example, but very rarely true pieces. And I think our listeners will understand what I mean. It's like, okay, well, I don't think you got any facts wrong, but that's not actually what's happening. And so it feels like the media isn't listening, the world isn't listening, and meanwhile, all of this stuff is happening on the ground. And the only fear, the only concern that seems to sort of get on the desk or get the attention of the university's administration, of our politicians, it seems to be this fear of anti-Semitism, which anti-Semitism is a real thing that we must address and resist. And there is growing anti-Semitism at this particular moment. And a lot to say on that, perhaps later in this conversation or another conversation. But what I wanted to focus on was the reality that this stuff is not going to be clean. And I don't think that like policing every aspect of protesters' speech is appropriate in this moment. I'll be transparent. Listeners know that I come from a more liberal background than many people on our team. I was out for some of the BLM protests, and there were a lot of chants that I heard, and then some speeches. I was like, hey, wait a second. I really don't agree with that. But I thought my job at that moment was not to like say what protesters should and should be saying, like the whole defund the police thing. Okay, wonderful idea that we're going to live in a world without police. But how do we get from here to there? I'm not so sure. There's like, and from my perspective, like, I think that feels disconnected from sort of the realities that we live in and many communities around the world. So the question isn't about defunding police, but reforming policing in a way that actually helps our communities thrive and doesn't burden police with 50 different jobs that, 48 of which they shouldn't be doing in the first place. But my point in sharing that was like showing up to a protest, being part of a protest is about embodied solidarity in a moment of extreme need. And we're not going to all align around the same message. We're not going to all align around the same things. But I think the effort to police, and I use that term metaphorically, and also, not how protesters who are standing up and saying, hey, we don't want our bombs to kill civilians. We believe that this is a genocide happening. We need to do whatever we can to stop. We university students of these elite universities have billions of dollars invested, including in companies that are profiting off of the sale of all these arms. We don't want that to happen anymore. Like, that is legitimate speech, and that should not be policed. That should be encouraged. One last thing here, I think there's a lot of odious speech that we in the US protect. And that's because we believe the government shouldn't interfere, that the marketplace of ideas is better than sort of this segmentation of speech and allowing government to have too much power around this stuff. So, for example, like, there are neo-Nazi marches in cities around the country that the police protect as and we would agree that that is actual hate speech. There's no debate there. This is real, vile, repugnant hate speech that we must resist in every way possible. I'm not arguing for Columbia University to allow Nazis to march on campus. No, I think there do have to be some limits within certain spaces. But what I am saying is that this core principle that to really combat hate speech is to allow for more free speech is fundamental. And then particularly at these points of rupture, when there are historic atrocities happening by every measure, this has to stop in Gaza right now. And every day we go on, it risks this cataclysm becoming something even more unimaginably worse than it already is. And Hamas isn't being eliminated. Hostages aren't returning home. Like, none of these supposed, objectives of the war are being achieved.
And that's part of the invitation I want to issue to our listeners today. And I think it's one I wrestle with, right? We obviously believe in self-interrogation, in calling people into better movements, into better speech, into a more holistic vision of engaging the world. But all of us also only have a finite amount of energy and time and ability to engage on all of this. And I think that there are often two options for how to respond. One is to critique protesters and to say, you're doing it wrong. I disagree with this. And another is to say, I might disagree with that, but instead of spending all my energy pointing fingers and saying that's what's wrong, I'm going to speak what I believe and my truth and my invitation much more strongly and loudly. And so that's where I think our network and our listeners today can be really effective in putting out the kind of vision and invitation for how we engage this that we want to see. It's reaffirming those principles of mutual flourishing. It's reaffirming that we can care about, Jewish colleagues, friends, neighbors, and Palestinian friends, colleagues, neighbors. That's not to say that the discourse we're having here today isn't important, but when I think about what I want our network to do with what they're taking away from this conversation, is not necessarily to dive down into a better way to critique what's happening. It's to reaffirm and recommit to speaking in a voice and a framework that they believe in, that we think is invitational and has room for hopefully everyone, or at least has room for everyone's flourishing. And that can be just as important as knowing exactly how to respond when we see people saying things that we might not fully agree with.
And Sarah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because in this particular moment, what that means redoubling down on our efforts to call for ceasefire, release of hostages, humanitarian aid, pulling every lever that we have. If we haven't spoken up, our voice has even more power than before. So it's not about, are you with the protesters at Columbia or UCLA or the counter protesters or whomever? It's like, keep our eyes on the prize right now. And this has been headed to a very dark place for a long time. Historic atrocities are happening right now. I think, what's happened in every other student protest movement is history looks kindly upon them, not negatively. And you have all these debates about rule of law, order, how this should be conducted or whatnot. But right now, we know very clearly that this onslaught is producing the exact opposite objectives of its stated goals. Hamas is stronger as an ideology. There's no plan for the day after Gaza. Hostages aren't coming home. And meanwhile, millions of Palestinians have been enduring conditions that are truly medieval. Most human beings have never been able to even imagine the horrors day after day for 7 months that these folks have experienced. And the world is feels like it's coming apart at its seams. This real risk of regional, it's already regional in a lot of ways, but regional and global conflagration, the isolation of the US, all of this is coming to fruition, just as we predicted right after October 7th and actually long before, right? So the point right now is that we need this to stop. If you haven't spoken up, okay, that's fine. But now, talk to your friends, call your members of Congress. Your voice has so much more power than mine does, because I have been speaking up every single day, and people, most of the people on this call, right? So if you come from a Christian background and you're in a swing state, speak up. Speak up looks like conversations with folks. It looks like protesting as well. It looks like calling your members of Congress, not once, but repeatedly, saying, hey, we don't want any more weapons to go to these horrific human rights violations. We don't want any more money. Let them know. Right now, your voice has extraordinary power. So I encourage all of you, keep our eyes on the prize right now. We got to get this to stop. The house next door is burning. There are children dying. There's a gas tank in the basement. It's ready to explode if we don't put this fire out. And now we're arguing about, well, this person said that. That person said this. Oh my gosh, like who's going to own the house when it's over? Yeah, all sorts of complicated things. But the thing that we need to focus on is clear. We need to stop the fire and save as many children as possible now.
Being on campus talking to folks, I just realized that no one trusts media. This, as a reporter, this is so tragic to me. And from all sides, no one trusts media. And I'm so if you don't trust media, you go for social networks. And social networks, the information you get are unverified. Everyone can write anything that sounds believable or plausible, and you're fine. It's being shared millions of times. So for me, this is one of the big tragedies of our time, that people feel like they can't trust us and our words and what we're saying, or it's not independent. So I'm kind of confused, because I feel it's happening in Germany, but it's happening on a much bigger scale in the US. And if it's happening to students, those who are, the heads, where the discourses, big societal discourses are carried out, the universities, and those don't trust the media, but just fall back on social media. Like, what are we doing with this? And what are journalists, like, you're a professor at Columbia journalism school, like, what are you doing with this? But again, that's a whole other block of
a lot of what I've been seeing has come from social media and friends who are in academia and often PhD students in teaching at campuses across the country that have had various levels of protest. And I am trusting what they are sharing, because often it's either they're not getting, right, their campuses aren't getting covered in national news, nor do they need to be. Or, right, when I read the headlines that are like, protesters and counter-protesters clash, and I see the images of what happens, right, anytime anyone uses clashes, I just immediately, right, look for some deeper story or bias, because to me that word has never actually been employed in a way that's actually helpful, as we know when we talk about Israel-Palestine. And so I am one of those people, right, who is craving good journalistic sources. And I loved the article that you wrote about your experiences on campus. And also when I see the ones that aren't, doing a great job of recovering or reporting based on the first people accounts that I know from you guys, from other folks, like, social media is the only place I have to turn to hear from folks on campus and students the impact on the people who are actually there, who aren't being represented. So I hear you. Like, I don't know where that distrust comes from. I think it absolutely needs to be challenged. And also it's kind of a catch-22 when I'm seeing this happen in real time and seeing the ways that it's not actually playing out.
I mean, I think what we're definitely seeing is that it's also, entrenching us into our echo chambers, right? And we're displacing ourselves from the opportunity to build relationships across lines of difference, which is part of this work of transformation, right? We talked earlier about this idea of trust and shared grief being the pathway towards inclusive movements and coalitions that actually help build societal change, right? If we historically, when we've seen the greatest movement towards justice, towards true peace, it's been when coalitions have been built across lines of difference with communities from various sectors, different backgrounds and different experiences come together in collaboration on a shared goal. And so I think, part of this trends that we're seeing in ways that we receive and, analyze and trust information, it's actually, it's potentially quite dangerous for our ability to create effective social movements and social change. So I think it's an important point that you're raising, Marina. And I think your particular access into these spaces and, positionality there is really helpful. And I, for one, would love to hear from you more on the show, or hear, more of your reporting, because I know you're doing so from a really deep well of not only personal experience, but care about these issues and about these communities. Having worked with you for many years, I know that that's true. And so I'm just grateful for the work that you're doing in your reporting, for being on this show with us, sharing your perspective. Where are so many people across, the time of Telos and all of us in our team are better to know you, for sure. So thanks for being on this show. And for all of our listeners, I think there's so much to take away from this episode, as we heard from Rabbi Jill about these distinctions between Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and how language can be used, to be inclusive or can unintentionally exclude others. And then what's happening on these campus protests, and how ultimately they're helping us to pay attention to what's happening right now in Gaza. And really, that's where our focus should be, as Greg has invited us. We can talk and we should talk and we should debate and discuss, what's happening on these campuses. How do we build safe, environments for students where also they're invited to be uncomfortable with new ideas? But ultimately, there's historic atrocities happening as we speak. And our focus needs to be there. Our advocacy needs to be there, right? And if we're distracted by what's happening here, I think we've missed the point, ultimately. And so for all of you who are listening, again, as Greg invited us, use our script, talk to your elected officials, have conversations in your community. We have so many resources for you to engage, for you to host a screening or a book study. There are so many ways that you can participate in this work to orient all of us towards mutual flourishing right now. We'll invite all of you to do this with us, and we're excited to hear how it goes. So thanks for listening, folks, and we'll see you next time.